A young boy was ripped away from his parents, sold into slavery, shipped halfway around the world, and when he finally made it back home, his family and his entire village had been wiped out. But that was not the end of the story for a Paxtuck Indian named Squanto. It was a beginning not only for him but for America. In fact, historians say without Squanto, the Pilgrims who settled America would likely not have survived their first winters near Plymouth, Massachusetts. The story of overcoming adversity is told in a beautifully illustrated book called Squanto and the Miracle of Thanksgiving, written by Eric Metaxas. He joins me now live from New York. Hi, Eric.
How do you do?
Well, when we were talking about your book and setting up this segment, we sort of went around the group and said, okay, does everybody remember the story of Squanto? And it was about 50-50. And a couple people said, you know, when you made the hats and you talked about the Pilgrims. And I mean, seriously, a lot of people don't remember his life, what he stood for, and why it's important to remember him.
Well, it's an amazing story, and if I hadn't done the original research myself, I kind of wouldn't believe it. It's one of those stories. There's not that much primary material on it. I mean, they didn't write too much in 1620. But when you read it all and you put it all together, you say, this is an out-and-out miracle. I can't see any other way to read it, but God's hand seemed to be involved in what happened to these pilgrims. And I said I have to put this in a book for kids to read and also for parents to read, because hardly anyone that I know knows this story, and it's so outrageous, I have to get it out there.
Well, let's talk about that miracle and why you view it as so outrageous that you had to get it out there.
Well, I think, we've all, I shouldn't say we've all, but a lot of people have heard of Squanto. But what they don't know is the story behind the story. Like, how did he get there? He just pops out of the woods, and he helps them do all these different kinds of things. And so when I did the research, what I found absolutely astounded me. For example, around 1608, this is 12 years before Pilgrims landed, we have English trading ships coming down along the coast of what's today Massachusetts, trading with the Indians. I had no idea that there were English ships, lurking around Massachusetts and trading with these folks. And so these Indians, trustingly came down to the water to trade with these Englishmen, and of course, these were bad Englishmen in this ship, and they took Squanto. They put him on their ship. They took him across the Atlantic Ocean in 1608, a little boy from a tribe in Massachusetts, and sold him into slavery in Malaga, Spain. But where it gets really insane is that he was bought by some monks who had evidently treated him really well and figured out a way to get him all the way up to England, so that around 1612 he finds himself in England working as a stable hand in London for a family called Slaney, with the idea that he would get the next ship back over to Massachusetts. But if you're looking for a ship back, that's like being on the moon and saying, so when's the next ship going back to Earth? There are no ships going back. You're kind of stuck. So he was sort of stuck there. But amazingly, around 1618, after he'd lived away for 10 years and lived in London for 5 years, he found a ship, and they took him all the way back. He worked as a translator or something like that.
Because he had learned the language with his family in England.
Exactly.
Right.
And so he gets kind of dropped off around, what's today Plymouth, which is where he grew up. And he runs home, and he goes to the village, and there's no one there. Everyone has been wiped out by smallpox, which is, a nightmare. So after 10 years of dreaming of the day that he would go home, he actually gets home and everyone has died. And so he went to live in the woods alone by himself. It's incredibly sad that his dream almost came true and then everyone had died. So he's living in the woods alone, and then cut to a year later, this band of pilgrims, we call them pilgrims, gets off a ship called the Mayflower, and they settle in a place called Plymouth, Massachusetts, which was exactly where Squanto had grown up. And of course, what we forget is that they had some of the most brutal, horrifying times any human being could imagine. They were all dying, basically. I mean, any of us who has a wife or a husband or kids, to think of burying your family. I mean, these pilgrims were following God, and they get there, everything goes wrong, and they're dying like flies. And so in the spring, 50 of them had died, 50 out of 100. And you can imagine them praying and begging God for some kind of an answer, some kind of deliverance. Help us. And out of the woods walks an Indian named Squanto, speaking perfect English. He'd obviously been in London more recently than they had.
And they believed, you talk about, they believed he was the Joseph. They look in the Bible, they read about Joseph, they said, Squanto, you're our Joseph. God sent you to us. And then let's talk about the relationship. What happens and what they do for each other.
They basically adopted him. I mean, he had nowhere to go. He was the last member of his tribe, so he had no place to go. And he had grown up where they had settled. So he showed them everything there was to know. He showed them how to catch fish, where the lobsters were, how to tread the eels out of the mud in the stream beds. He basically single-handedly showed them how to survive. And they adopted him as one of theirs. And again, he could speak English, and he knew London, and they totally adopted him. And in fact, in his journal, William Bradford writes that Squanto was a special instrument sent by God to deliver us. I mean, it's one of those things that if you don't see God's hand in that, you know, it's just completely amazing that they are in the middle of nowhere and an Indian walks out of the woods speaking English. I mean, it almost doesn't make sense, and yet we know historically that it's true.
And they had this Thanksgiving dinner. We got to bring it into context to the fact that we celebrate like they did on this day every year.
A few months later, exactly, you know, they had survived, they decided to stay. I mean, we forget that they could have gone home. They didn't go home. They stayed and they flourished. And of course, a couple months later, they celebrated being there on the day that we call Thanksgiving, and we've been celebrating it ever since.
So, remembering Squanto's character, there's a lot of things, not just, you know, you've touched on the spiritual angle, but also just the fact that no matter what race, what color, everybody embraced each other.
Well, that's what's so amazing, that this isn't some kind of politically correct spin that somebody put on this. This is historically true. You have a picture of a bunch of English people who were broken. They're just at their wits' end. And then on the other hand, you have a picture of a Native American who is also broken, totally at his wits' end. Both of them are just, you can imagine, crying out to God or whoever is listening, how did I get in this situation? What can I do? And God miraculously weaves them together in such a way that, as I say, you couldn't make it up. It's like right out of a movie. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful story. And it's a picture of the harmony that we had right at the beginning of our history. It's a beautiful thing. It should something we should think about.
Whether Squanto or Sacagawea, we can't forget what American Indians have done for us. The book, Squanto and the Miracle of Thanksgiving, Eric Metaxas, what a pleasure to talk to you today.
My pleasure. Thank you.